Great.
Right. Just give it one more minute and then we'll kick off. In case everybody's clocks aren't synchronized. Just to say, I have started recording, so everyone should be aware of that. Okay, well, I'm gonna start just as I say that. I'm gonna need to let Gary or Lucy, can you let people in if while I'm talking? But a very warm welcome to everyone. I'm really glad you could be here. You may not have the best weather, so maybe this is the place to be today, where we're going to talk about all things allotments. And so really the purpose of our training is to look at how to manage and get organized with your committees, look at your legal structure, look at top tips for working with an allotment authority, how to manage waiting lists, the importance of leases, licenses, and tenancy agreements, and undertaking risk assessments and insurance. I'm just going to share my screen now. Wait. Hopefully, if I can get this started, I should be able to. Right, that's more proper now. And what there are 4 of us from Social Farms and Gardens here today. So we've got Gary Mitchell. You can give us a wave, Gary. Lucy Taylor and Sarah Collick. And then myself, who's just going to be facilitating mostly. But Lucy, Sarah, and Gary from our Welsh team and are going to do a lot of the presenting and hopefully answering your questions as well. We're going to really focus on managing your site and licenses and agreements. And as I did say, hopefully when you signed up, you noticed we're recording this. So if you know somebody who couldn't attend, then they can watch this again. And we're also going to be sharing the presentations afterwards as well. So just a few little housekeeping rules here. Obviously, you can have your camera on. We're very happy to have that, and that's not a problem. But if you can stay on mute until we get to sort of the question bit, or when we go to the breakout rooms, that would be good. And also, please do use the chat function if you just need to make a comment and you want everyone to know, or you want to ask a question, or if you're having any problems, and we'll see what we can do to try and sort things out. And if you come out of this by accident, don't worry, just go right back into the link that you were sent and you can rejoin using exactly the same link. So I think that's all I need to tell you about that. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So what we wanted to do was, in fact, we wanted to start with a poll. Just to get your opinion on sort of where you are with your allotment site. So I'm going to launch this poll now, and we just ask you to have a look and give us your answers. Right, I think that might be everyone, and I can share that with all of you. So it looks like we're evenly split between owned and managed by the local authority and owned by the local authority but managed by the local allotment association. There are a few of you who have a site that's managed and owned by the town or community council, and a few privately owned. and no one from the community that is owned and managed by a community group. So that's really interesting. It gives us a sense of who's here and where they're from. So thank you for that. Hopefully you can all see that. I'll stop that now. Hopefully. Does that stop polling? Should have stopped. Yes. No, it's still polling. Is the poll still up? Yeah, it's down. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we're just gonna kick off just with a little video that we've got. It's just a very short video, but we think it's quite interesting. So I'm gonna share my screen again and hopefully get into the video. Hold on a minute. Bear with me. Sorry, no problem here.
Whilst you're doing that, Heidi,
the video. Yeah, go ahead and talk.
I was going to say I might just ask for a show of hands of who's quite well aware of social farms and gardens, and who's perhaps not, or if we can't see you, just drop it in the chat. Just generally interested if people know about us or not quite sure or heard a little. So yeah, give us a thumbs up if you know about us. That's great, because sometimes we assume we're talking to people that know enough about us as an organisation, but we'll perhaps give you a very brief overview of what we do and why, and particularly in Wales, once we get started with some of the presentations as well. Thanks.
Sorry, my video has disappeared, so I'm bringing it back up. I'm going to try again. Here we go.
In the countryside.
Let me start this from the beginning. Right.
My name's Amber Wheeler, and I'm the chairperson of Nabath Allotments and Community Orchard. There isn't much land available around here, even though we're in the countryside. The land that's available to rent is virtually none. It's very hard for people to find land to rent, so we didn't have much choice. And this field that we started the allotments in is actually a north-facing field. And some people said, you'd never get anything to grow there. Nothing will ever grow, as you can see. You know, it's absolutely amazing. We've got tons of produce now. So we basically had to make do with what we had, but when we designed the allotments, we put the allotments in the sunniest spot and the most sheltered spot. Then the orchard then became on the sort of steep part of the hill, so that to make use of that steep hill and be able to do something with it. We have a good relationship with our landowner. We pay them a good amount per year. We have a tenancy agreement, a lease with them, and then we subdivide then and have tenancy agreements with all our plot holders, and the income we get from our tenants then pays the lease of the overall land. We also have a bit of money left over for maintenance.
Hi, I'm Phil Bird. I'm Director at Swansea Community Farm, and we're the only operational city farm in Wales. I wasn't involved in the project at the time, but I do know that we undertook feasibility studies on at least 2 or 3 sites, of which this was one. And in the end, I think what swung it for this site was its location. It was always very strong in its ethos as a community farm, and to be in an area of social need was quite important to the project. So that's why we're in Forest Park and serve some of the more deprived communities in Swansea. It was important to have access to people as a city farm and a community farm. It's all about bringing people from the city into the countryside within the city farm context. Having a social element to the project was also very important, and that's why we're in one of the more deprived areas of Swansea and not somewhere more well-heeled where we will probably be better off financially, but in terms of meeting the social need, it's very important that we're where we are. So we did the feasibility study, then I think negotiations began with the landowners, which was the Education Authority of Swansea City Council. A lease was negotiated, all the necessary permissions, planning permissions, they were all sought and eventually granted, and we were up and running as a farm. As I say, 1998 we got the farm. Our first building went up in 2002. I think our first member of staff was in 2000. So it's a very gradual process. So don't expect an instant farm. Sure. Or if you do, it won't have the same feel as something that's grown gradually and incrementally.
All right, come back. Great. It wasn't all about allotments, but we did think that was just worth looking at quickly, and a nice little video that was produced about probably 6 or 7 years ago now, but quite interesting. I'm going to hand over to Gary now, really, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about sort of the background of the work that we've been doing with the Welsh Government and looking at sort of getting organised with your allotment site.
2 seconds. Okay, I'll just take my machine just a moment to warm up whilst I'm running Zoom. Hopefully you can see that first slide of my presentation there. I can see some of your faces, which is great, but not all of you now. You're slightly smaller on my screen, but it is worth just me maybe giving you that sort of hopefully a minute overview of social farms and gardens. For a long time, and some of you may remember us when we were called the Federation of City Farm and Community Gardens, a bit of a mouthful. We'd never quite got it right at any meetings. People could never quite get the acronyms right either. And a few years ago, we decided probably now's the right time to change the name, and that was focusing around a merger with a sister organisation of ours, Care Farming UK. So the two organisations have formally merged, name change, and we now exist as Social Farms and Gardens. But we've been around 40 years. So in fact, last year was our 40th celebratory year, but the celebrations sadly weren't there to accompany that. So we might have a 41st celebration or a 42nd, who knows when we can. We've got teams on the ground across every UK nation, if you like. So team in Northern Ireland, team in Scotland, teams across England, and then a team in Wales. And our Wales team is currently 7 members of staff. So we're quite well resourced. We're geographically spread. We've got offices in Bangor, in Newtown, and in Cardiff, although we're currently not obviously really inhabiting any of those. And our Cardiff one we've put on hold for the moment whilst people are home working. We've got 28 members of staff across the UK, and I guess we have a whole range of different areas of focus, but it's primarily around communities interested in food, green spaces, all those sorts of things. And in Wales, we are primarily funded, but not solely, by Welsh Government. So we receive direct funding by Welsh Government to deliver a lot of their outcomes and their aims and their objectives under things like Future Generations Act, etc., etc. So we've been commissioned by Welsh Government, and this is their sort of outdoor landscape recreation division, to really start to get a bit of a grip around what allotments are looking like in Wales and how potentially they could be improved. And that came about by really a direct pledge by the First Minister, and some would sort of say a personal manifesto pledge, when he took office a few years ago now. And obviously we're about to potentially go through that change of government, who knows, but he made a commitment to double the number of allotments in Wales. And obviously if you're in a political seat at the moment, it's good to say that you've done some work against your pledges, even if it is a personal one and maybe not a party one or a full manifesto one. There lies the problem. Actually, nobody in Wales knew where we were starting from with that number of allotments. So they commissioned us to do some research, and we think we've currently got the best grasp that anyone has ever had on how many allotment sites are out there and how many plots are operating behind those sites. But that's with a caveat that there's still quite a few gaps in there. It is really hard. There is no central point of information for allotments existing anywhere really in the UK or in Wales. We ended up having to go down freedom of information requests to local authorities around what they do and don't do around allotments. And even then, some of them I will I will sort of note that they managed to wiggle out of a freedom of information request even, and some decided it wasn't a freedom of information request and therefore they don't have to answer our questions. So we've still got a few gaps, and that's a bit frustrating, but we're working on those gaps. But anyway, we've got the best picture we have. And based on that research, we put a report together about what the provision was looking like across the local authorities in Wales and who was delivering the provision. And it's interesting to note your answers to the polls. That sort of matches with what we've got, but actually there is a fairly strong community provision out there of allotment sites as well, which is great. But there's that range of local authority led ones, local authority devolved managed ones, a few private ones popping up, and then a few community ones as well. And they have then given us some funding this year, which some of you are beneficiaries of, which is fantastic, to try and create that little bit of extra spaces for new plots in the worst performing targeted local authority areas. So we've been given some capital money and some revenue money to support 3 local authorities this year. That's Wrexham, Swansea and Gwynedd, and they were the poorest performing ones on provision versus population. And then we've got a team supporting them to get sites up and running with some new allotment plots, or redevelop existing ones, get rid of some underused plots, turn some uncultivated land back into cultivated land, which is great. So that's happening this year up till the end of March. So about, oh gosh, I'm guessing now, but about £80,000 worth of capital money has gone out to a dozen or more sites to do that. And then we've been given another bit of money internally to create an allotment development team, so somewhere where the skill sets around allotments are held. And then Welsh Government themselves are going to distribute an amount of capital money to all, or it's available to all 21 local authorities in Wales to help them create new allotment sites. So that's really exciting. It's the first time they've really put some emphasis on allotments in Wales, and they're putting some money behind it, and we'll have some staff resources and some toolkits and things like that. So that's where we're coming from. The bit I wanted to talk about was around just how we're assisting some of the community groups to sort of get themselves organised to take on plots, how they're currently being managed and stuff. And it's worth just looking at the different types of those ownership and management. And it's worth us just clocking that the absolute duty for allotment provision rests with a local authority, but that could be any level of local authority. So it could be your county council, your county borough council, but actually it could be your town council, or even it could be your community council. And there is a statutory requirement for local authorities to provide allotment resources if there is a demand. And the demand is currently set at 6 people wanting to access a plot that pay their council tax, it's worded as. So that's the very low level starting point. And often in some of our local authorities, they are owned and managed by the local authority themselves. So that is, they provide the land and they provide a level of management across those to allow people to come and go on that site, provide the access, take the rents, etc., etc. And that's termed self-led. Then in another half a dozen cases or so, the allotment authority provides the land, but actually prefers to devolve the management out to allotment associations. So either in some cases, a sort of global organisation that looks after their local authority plots, or more often is the case, a smaller allotment association that either manages one site or maybe 1, 2 or 3 clustered sites in their own region. So that's another way that they sometimes do it. And what we should say, sorry, if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll try and look at them as we're going through, but we've got a Q&A session at the end. Then there is that provision of community-led ones where we support almost 500 community garden sites across Wales, and a good majority or a good percentage of those provide private micro allotment plots, so somewhere where there's a bit of an area of space for people to do that individual bit of gardening within a community setting. And then, as I said, more increasingly we're seeing a private provision of allotment sites cropping up, and that tends to be a farmer that's quite switched on, realizes actually per acre he can get far more money's worth than a grass let or a commercial agricultural let, which is in Wales, you're looking at around £100–150 an acre per year for an acre of land agriculturally. If you divide that plot up into 15 allotment plots, you're looking at somewhere in the region of £2,500 income. So there's a number of farmers very cleverly doing that. And I will say there are some farmers doing it effectively pro bono, so that we're supporting a small scheme called Give an Acre or an Adopt an Acre, where farmers are offering up land for free almost, and then allowing communities to come in and manage it, which is really exciting. We then just want to move on to how within those different types of ownership the committee themselves might structure themselves. And I think the overarching question really is around what is the risk and where is the liability, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on, both Sarah and Lucy. But if an association, for instance, takes on an allotment site and tries to manage it, there is then a risk, if you like, a liability to that association. And if that association isn't a constituted group and a formally recognised organisation, the risk and the liability rests with the individuals within that association, and therefore potentially a higher risk of things going a bit wrong. So we just want to talk a little bit about that later on and explore some of the options. But there is some really simple ways to set up a community group, and in some cases that's the way that we look at doing it. So you could be a constituted group. You could be an unconstituted group at the lowest level. So that is just a group of people that want to come together to do something good and for all the right reasons. And they don't have a lot more than that, just that willingness to work together for a common goal. The next level above that is the constitution bit. So bringing those people together is effectively enshrined in a simple document, and that might be 1 page, it might be 2 pages, in the worst case scenario it might be 10. I very much doubt it in those small community groups, but a set of do's and don'ts, why we're here, why we're coming together, common aims laid out on paper, normally then appointed chair and a secretary, treasurer maybe, and just get going. There's no regulation around them, so there's no oversight. If you somehow take in £1 million and spend £800,000, that's fine. There's no one looking over your shoulder and wondering how you've banked £200,000. There is no regulation around constituted or unconstituted groups. You have to operate within the law in any form of governance, obviously, and that's an absolute given. So some groups might choose that route. And some of the key reasons why you might think about one version over another would be around, simplicity, ease of management, something that groups can buy into, or individuals. But in some cases, it's a very definite need to access either public funding, so grants through the lottery or through your local CVA or through Welsh Government. And hardly any of those institutions would fund an individual. And certainly some of them have very strict rules that you have to have a minimum of 2 signatures. You have to have a named bank account in that group's name, so it's not going into a personal bank account. And for that reason, you could set up a constituted group, and that would allow you to access a high street or an alternative finance bank account, given that you've got the right rules there. Others would look for that slightly higher level of regulation or formality, and the popular ones that we see within allotment groups tends to be community interest companies, and we know a couple of you here on this call are gone down that route. So it's a level of a company. You declare an absolute definition of the community that you want to support. That could be place-based. So I want to support the community of Tree Herbert to do more growing, and that could be your definition, really simple. It might be, I want to support anyone that's interested in environmental aims and objectives and things like that. It might be, I just want to support the youth of my community to get their hands dirty, whatever you might decide. And the registration process, basically, then you submit your ideas to the KIC registrar, and they will assess that based on the merits of what you tell them you're going to do. And hopefully they will approve your registration. So you have a company set up in the background effectively, and then you have this formal identity of the community that you're going to support. And the regulator each year will ask you to generate a report to them to say, what have you done to benefit your community? You've told us you're going to do this. Now, please tell me how you've done it. So there's that little bit more oversight. Many of you, I'm sure, will be aware that a company, private limited by company or guarantee, doesn't have that level of oversight at all. You register, you submit your details online, and that's pretty much it. You then have to do your HMRC and all your accountant stuff. And there's an organisation out there, if you haven't heard of them, the National Allotment Society. We've got some references at the end of the slides that you can go back to, and they're the sort of overarching overseers of all things allotment across the UK. They've got a slightly different organisation in Scotland, but it's all joined together. And they have a set of model templates to their members, so you pay a small membership to them. And in the main, for allotment associations, they are companies limited by guarantee, because there's different opportunities for different types of companies. You could be a shareholding company, you could be a private limited company, etc., etc., but they're all quite complicated. What the NAS suggest is a simple company limited by guarantee structure. That registration, if you do it online, only costs about £14. It's about £30 if you do it by paper these days. Takes less than 4 weeks to submit your registration. You basically use their model templates, pay your fee, upload it onto Companies House, tell them who's managing that company, and away you go. You can open up your bank account, you can attract funding if you've got the right levels of rules and articles in there. I'm going to move on. As I say, if you've got any specific questions, do just ask. And then what we sort of wanted to move away from that sort of the structure thing. Once you've got your structure operating and potentially got access to a site, how do you manage it? How do you deal with the incomings of people's and the outgoings and the non-cultivation, the underuse, the overuse, the overdemand, and things like that? So just a few bullet points here, really. We've got a host of resources to help you. So that's one of the first places to look. Welsh Government have funded us to develop all of those over the last year. So we're really confident that there's some great resources. We'll put a link at the end. You'll be able to access them. Our membership structure is completely free. We do encourage people to join as groups to us so that we can show that support to our movement, if you like. But all of our resources are available on the website. I say almost all of ours are available on the website. There's a few in a member section that you need to join for. Don't jump in 2 feet. We've sort of said there, you need to spend a bit of time planning, thinking about who you're trying to benefit, how's your land going to work, how's access going to work, how are you going to get materials in, how are you going to get materials out, how are people going to get to that site? Have they got to walk? Great. How do they then bring compost and tools? Have you got shared space for facilities? Do you want to discourage driving there? Question mark. But it's got to work for your communities that you're operating in. Absolutely, these days we hear time and time again that the size of a traditional allotment site is really overwhelming for anyone that is probably anything but retired and still of a very fit and healthy statute to manage a full-size allotment plot. They're hundreds of square meters in space and they take a lot of management. So more and more we're seeing allotments divide those plots up into half plots, sometimes down into quarter plots even, and then we're seeing some emerge as low as what we would call micro plots, something that allows that starting platform for people to come and have a go, get their hands dirty, but not take on that huge burdensome full-size plot. So there's different methods that you can do that, and you can make that quite simple in your tenancy agreements if you go down that route. And then we're sort of suggesting these days more and more an allotment site can be a great, let's say, isolated space, as in somewhere I'm going to go and escape from whatever for an hour and I'm going to potter down the allotment. But actually what they are good at, as well as a site coming together to share the coffee next to the shed, sit around a fire pit if they've got a kettle on, have that point of conversation with a quite diverse community in many cases. And that's something we really start to encourage more and more. So having access to communal tool sheds is a great idea, where people then on low incomes or people want to cycle there or walk there don't have to worry about taking the car every time. We're seeing more and more communal polytunnels pop up where propagation can begin, and that's a real benefit for allotment holders to get started. Talked about a fire pit. Basic facilities are really essential these days. We know that the older generation might be quite happy to pee in a pot in the shed, but I think we've moved on a little way from that these days, and some communal toileting facilities are great. And obviously there's a whole range of ways you can do that. And we definitely encourage from our organisational side access to community groups to take on plots. And in some traditional allotment sites, that's pretty much impossible because of the way that they're structured and the way that they've set their systems up. But we do feel they miss a big trick on that. And then just to start to get us thinking around really about some of those responsibilities if you do brave taking on a site or administering a site or setting up your own. What have you got to be considerate of? So you might well be asked to supply water to your plots or work out clever ways that they can irrigate and capture water. You may well be responsible for handling money. So plot rents coming in, people going out, etc., etc. So administering that, and in some cases that's quite technical these days. That's direct debits, that's app payments, that's all sorts of innovative ways that people want to pay money these days rather than hand you 20 quid a year. Definitely got to take on a responsibility for managing waiting lists, and that's really important. We're going to have a specific conversation around that later. Dealing with non-cultivation is a tricky issue. Sometimes people will take on a plot because they are generally affordable, and then in some cases they don't actually manage them, but they do say, well, I've paid my 20 quid, so therefore it's mine. Please don't tell me off for growing weeds. And you have to have a robust system for that, because we obviously want people to use them and to grow produce. And complaints from your wider neighbours do crop up from time to time, particularly around the shantytown developments, sheds left, right and centre, cobbled together, pallet stages I've seen in some, or picnic balconies and things like that. People having fires when neighbours might not want it, and also the keeping of animals needs to all be considered. However, that sort of last line that says it's still all worth doing because there's absolutely that greater connection to community, and they really, you as members on the ground will understand far more the needs than a officer in a local authority office or at home these days would ever get to understand. So that's it from me. Let me stop sharing for a second, because we're going into a breakout session, aren't we, Heidi? Oh, you're on mute, Heidi. Sorry.
Right, sorry. Yes, we are going to go into a breakout session. Do you want me to introduce the question, or did you have it on a slide? I couldn't remember if that was.
No, it was, but I think actually we've taken it off. Sorry.
Taken out. Oh, okay. So we're gonna. I've got 4 breakout rooms, and we're gonna. I'll just tell Gary, Lucy, Sarah. Gary, you're in breakout room 1, Lucy in 2, and Sarah in 3, and I'll be in 4. And we're gonna feed back from the group, each of the staff. But the question we want you to look at, or the 2 questions that we'd like you to look at, is how are waiting lists managed by the different organizations represented in your group? And the other question is, how do you make sure allotments are well used and not derelict or unmanaged? If you haven't got all that, don't worry, your facilitator will know the questions as well. But we'd really like to spend about 15 minutes or so looking at that, and then we'll come back and have a bit of a feedback session. So you need do nothing. I am just going to open all the rooms, and then you will end up going into a breakout room. So we'll see you back here all together in about 15 minutes. Everybody will start piling in a minute.
That's fine. What I didn't ask you before we left, Heidi, was when you were going to kick us back out, so I didn't make a mental note of timings, but that's fine.
Okay, that's all right. No, I just kept in. Everyone, I think, is back, hopefully. You can't really tell me if you aren't, but I think you are, based on the numbers. So shall we just have a little quick feedback from each of the groups if we can? And do you mind if I start with you, Gary?
Yep, no, that's fine. It was nice. We had a real range of people in the discussion, local authority, association-led, and a new site developing. So that was really helpful. And I think on the question around waiting lists, there was certainly some different practice there. Local authority member from Denbighshire was saying that they do hold a central waiting list, but not quite clear on how much that list is managed. There is certainly a place where people in Denbighshire can go and register an interest for an allotment, which is a great start, and that's centrally held. On the association managed site that Chris introduced us to, they had that complication of taking over effectively a previously local authority led site, now running it on site, in-house, if you like, and having to do that transition with their members. They were told to inherit a 200 long waiting list of allotment people waiting for an allotment, but actually it was quickly evident that, again, that list wasn't managed, so that there was no point starting with that list. And that's definitely a fault we find fairly regularly with some central systems. If you don't manage your waiting list and you've got a 10-year waiting list, by the time you get a vacant plot and you start to work your way through your list, half the people have dead, moved on, moved out of area, emigrated, whatever it might be. So you need to manage your waiting lists. And talked about how actually having procedures in place really helps manage the waiting list. So Chris's site was now allowing people to come on a year sort of probationary trial, see how they go, give them a bit of support, but actually if they don't, having that ability to kick them off so that they can churn over more people. Writing to the list once a year to say, are you still interested? And collectively doing that across a number of local sites really helped. So as Chris pointed out, there could be those sneaky people that register 7 times on 7 different sites and end up getting 5 different sites, and that's probably not what we're interested in. So having the ability to manage the lists was important. And on the uncultivation side, it was partly about supporting people to cultivate, having robust procedures in place to actually move them on if they're not able to. But Chris raised an interesting point around they have got communities accessing sites or plots within their site, but actually in the current climate, a community group coming to manage a plot is really quite difficult. So you've got to have that process of support mechanism from the other allotment holders, bit of leeway, obviously, and let's see what happens in another 6 months when hopefully we're through the worst of the pandemic. So yeah, nice range of options.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Lucy, can you let us know?
Yeah.
Thinking?
Yeah, we had a good group. 3 people in my group are sort of embarking on thinking of setting up sort of community allotment sites or taking on allotment sites from the local authority. So we picked on Jerry a little bit because he's manages 4 allotment sites with his Bridgend Allotment Association on behalf of Bridgend County Borough Council. We got a bit of extracted some information out of him as to how they manage things. They essentially manage it on sort of a OneDrive system using Excel spreadsheets. The system is very much first in, first out, but they also manage it yearly as well, where they're asking people to sort of update them on their current situation if they're still looking for an allotment plot. They've had quite a surge in interest in the last year, which I think is quite common across the board. People wanting to gain an allotment plot. They've been able to kick out some people that haven't been cultivating to the standard they sort of signed up to, and get some new people onto the allotment plots. The non-cultivation side of things, the plot holder would get a letter of improvement and a month to sort of improve things if it's a low level breach. And then if they haven't by then they'll ask them to leave, and a new person from the waiting list will go on to that plot. Yeah, we talked about, you know, some other potential community sort of led models, where Jeremy is thinking of setting up a sort of community allotment community growing site on some Churchy in Wales land, which is nice to have the beauty of that flexibility where you can sort of have your own set of rules, whereas Jerry in Bridgend is dealing with statutory allotment sites as part of his allotment association. So it's two slightly different perspectives.
Okay, thanks very much, Lucy. Sarah, can you give us a bit of feedback from your group?
Yes, I can. So we had people from Denbighshire, Rhondda Cynon Taf, and Rhondda Cynon Taf and Vale of Glamorgan and Judith, who's setting up a community site in Bethesda. And it was pretty similar across the board, really. Waiting lists managed using Excel spreadsheets, which seems pretty much from everybody has had that same approach. There is allotment management software available, but I guess it depends on your budget and how many sites you've got, whether that's worth using. I know that Conwy Council does use that. So ranging from quarterly to yearly inspections, and then a letter, wait to hear a month back, and then 14 days notice. And of course, the perennial problem of lack of resources, allotments officers having other jobs as well, which are also overwhelming, like tree officers with a lot of trees in the local authority, or one officer here with 36 sites to manage, which is quite a handful, as well as that tree work. So, you know, and over years, maybe sites becoming a bit disused, and then you have the maintenance issues attached with that, which is why it's so important to keep on top of the you know, non-cultivation, but also clearly have a bit of leeway with people who are maybe going through a difficult time or illness, if they've had their plot a long time and it's only recently that it's become badly maintained.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. My feedback might be the shortest, just because we had a really interesting group, but everybody pretty much was from a sort of community-led and very brand new project or brand new allotment site. And so everybody was just trying to get land cleared for the site and get things up and running, rather than worry too much about waiting lists at the moment, although they do accept that there may be more demand than they can cope with, and that's something that they're going to have to think about. But because it's very new for most of the groups, and then we had Anna, who was from a housing association, so she started off by saying, I don't know anything, which is fine too, but it's not, yeah, it was kind of a new sites for everyone. So waiting lists haven't become a big problem yet to worry about, and then that's kind of similar to things being derelict, because at the moment, for quite a number of the people in my group, things were already derelict and they're becoming less derelict. So they're just getting things up and running now. So yeah, watch this space for those groups. Great. All right. I think what we're going to do is move it to the sort of second half of the training session, and we've got Lucy and Sarah who are going to talk to us more about the actual site and leases, licenses, tenancy agreements, and risk, and worrying about, not worrying, but thinking about risk. So over to you.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a brief sort of 10 minutes on something to do with, you know, your tenancy agreements. As you might imagine, on an allotment site, every tenant receives a copy of a tenancy agreement upon signing up for their plot. But things are slightly different depending on what arrangement you've got. If you're just on a local authority owned and managed site, then you would just get your tenancy agreement. Allotment societies who are managing on behalf of, say, the local authority or another landowner, you would get your tenancy agreement and expect to see some sort of rules and constitution of that association or society. But if you're also doing it, if the allotment association is doing something on behalf of another landowner, you would also expect to see the overall lease or a sort of management agreement or service level agreement that they're expected to sort of adhere to as sort of the allotment management society. So because if you're signing up to things in the tenancy agreement for your plot, you kind of need to have the overall perspective of what other things that that tenancy that allotment association needs to adhere to as well. But on the other end of the scale, you could be sort of a community-led, community-managed site, and you might just expect to see a simple license for your plot, which a license, difference between a license and a lease. A license is a bit more just about allowing you shared access onto the site and not so that you can't be accused of trespass. A lease is a bit more of a formal agreement where you have exclusive rights to that area of land. So you would expect to see a lease for an overall piece of land, if it's sort of owned by a community or an allotment association, and then perhaps a simple tenancy agreement or license if it's a community-led operation, where you allow sort of shared access on different parts of the allotment site, be it a plot or a particular area. But again, if that overall site is being leased from another landowner like the local authority, or we had the example of Church in Wales, you'd expect to see the overall lease that they're adhering to as well. We've got a toolkit that we're doing on, or pretty much just completed actually. So we will provide links to all of this type of information where you can sort of see a template tenancy agreement, and then the additional clauses that you might want to add. There are clauses, just coming on to that aspect, there are clauses that are sort of set in statutory legislation. Certainly, what is a reasonable rent, for instance, and the notice period that you have to give under the 1950s Allotment Act. There's a range of different allotment legislation ranging from 1908, I think it is, to 1950. But yeah, obviously, for instance, the rent must be reasonable, and you have to provide 12 months notice of termination of a tenancy agreement, unless there's been a breach, of course. I'd expect to see a plan of where the plot is, or which, where the land is related to, and sometimes that is missed off, and it's not very good practice, I would say. You need to have a plan, and also exactly who, the legal entities of who is signing up to the agreement. So as Gary touched on earlier, you need to be a legal entity. So if you're a plot holder, you as a person, now you're a legal entity, but sometimes community groups are allowed to have plots, or two or three plots sometimes, and one of the important things to remember is that a constituted group isn't really a legal entity, so you may need to sign up in individual names in that instance. So just be careful about that, and making sure that the land, that, you know, the person who the landowner is, or the allotment association, making sure that they're a legal entity as well, because otherwise it's not worth the paper it's written on. If there are any changes to the allotment agreement, you would need to provide a completely new agreement, and that goes for a license and a lease as well. You know, you'd expect to see a completely new agreement if you want to make changes. Some of the more statutory things is whether you can have livestock on the site, or what types of livestock are allowed, and also what the permitted uses are. Things like whether you're allowed to have a fire pit or bonfires. Sometimes that's restricted to certain times of the year. Some of the more optional type clauses might be that you don't want to see any barbed wire on the site, and the specific types of enclosure that are allowed. You know, whether you're allowed to put up advertisements for any particular things that you want to do, you would probably need to get permission to do that. So those sorts of clauses can come up. Some of the much more sort of popular and standard clauses might be around water, whether you're expected to rainwater harvest from any sort of greenhouse or shed you've got, or if you're allowed to use water on site coming from a tap, or, you know, a borehole. You know, who's managing that water, and how is it supposed to be used? You know, you would definitely expect to see something in a tenancy agreement, or even a license on that. Structures, just quickly sort of mentioning that, you would tend to see a clause relating to structures, and what you're allowed to build. Remember that those clauses are just what the landowner is saying you can do. The planning side of things, whether you need planning permission, is completely separate to that, and you should inquire with the local planning authority. There are certain clauses that are pretty standard, allowing small sheds, or small sort of greenhouses or glass houses. That is an important clause that, you know, the landowner needs to stipulate. Things like disputes as well, how they deal with any appeals, any trees on the site. I've mentioned forms of enclosure. Also, whether you're allowed to have bees is something that should be dealt with these days. Certainly very standard, you know, making sure that your plot is kept in a good state of repair and cultivated to a certain standard, and what the procedure is for non-cultivation and moving people on. Those are very important clauses. Newer things that come up these days are GDPR, making sure that you're not using personal information, or how that personal information is stored. Insurance, whether they expect you to have your own insurance. Perhaps something on not being able to sublet your plot to anyone else. You're the person that's in charge of that plot. And things like early break clauses or probationary periods that I think came up in the last session. So yeah, those are some of the newer things, but yeah, I just wanted to touch on some of the clauses you might expect to see. Just to say that obviously that sort of thing is in the toolkit. We do have standard templates and the clauses that you can add as optional extras. I manage the Community Land Advisory Service part of it's a programme run by Social Farms and Gardens on sort of leases, licenses, access to land and planning permissions, and there'll be a link to the resources page at the end of this webinar. I think we're going to hand over now to Sarah, who is going to tell us a little bit about risks and insurance.
Thanks, Lucy. So whether you're a local authority or a community managed site, you need to have insurance, and It's not enough just to have insurance. You need to be able to show that you've managed the risks on your site. So any land that you own, lease or manage, you have a duty of care to anybody on that land. So that will include your employees, if you're the local authority, obviously. That will include the plot holders, but also anybody that trespasses on your land. So if somebody breaks into the allotment site, you still have a duty of care that that site is safe for them. If your site is local authority managed and you pay your plot rent directly to the local authority, they are responsible for the management of the site, for the management of the risk and the insurance. But if you're a community managed site, it's really important that you are a incorporated body. So a limited company or a charitable incorporated organisation, there's various forms of legal body that you can set up as, but that basically means that the liability is not yours personally, it's the company, it's the organisation that is liable. So it's really important to have that distance between you and the liability. You don't want to be personally liable. You don't want to personally sign the lease when you're renting land, and you don't want to be personally responsible for the risk on the site. That has to be the company that you set up that bears that risk. You could still be legally liable for anything that happens, but only if you're very negligent as a director of that company. Which is, it's pretty rare for you to be found that negligent. But it's really important as well that risk doesn't paralyse people when you want to do things. You just need to show that you've considered the hazards and you've done your best to mitigate any risks for the people that are using your site. So there's two elements to managing risk and ensuring your site is safe. So one is doing your risk assessment and the other is having adequate insurance. So, and in our resources, can you move the slide on, Gary? Gary, can you, thank you. Yeah, so in our resources, we've got a whole suite of documents available to you, including some health and safety information and some sample risk assessment and hazard checklist forms and instructions on how to use them. So you take your hazard checklist form around your site and look at all the different things that might be a hazard, go and sit down and fill in your risk assessment form. And it's really important that the whole committee is involved in this. If only one person is aware of the risks and the hazards, then that's not really very useful. Everybody needs to be aware. So get several members of the committee involved if it's a community managed site, and make sure that everybody that rents a plot has a copy of the risk assessment so they understand why they're not allowed to have fragile glass at ground level, or why they're only allowed to have a fire in a container. Whatever it is, they need to understand why those rules are there so that they pay some heed to them, basically. So the terminology is, I always still find this confusing, but the hazard is a thing with potential to cause harm, and the risk is the likelihood of that harm occurring. So for example, a fire is a hazard, and you can manage the risk of burns or damage to property by having some rules around that fire. So, you know, having water available when you have a fire, only having fires at certain times, and maybe having that fire in a container. It's really up to you as the management committee how the different hazards are mitigated, the risks are mitigated. And it doesn't mean that you can't do things, it just means that you have to think about how you do them and have rules around them. So if something does happen, you can refer to the document that you put together and say, we did think of that and we did try and mitigate that risk as far as we could. So those forms are all available on our website, and there'll be a link to that at the end. So but just in case, despite your sterling efforts to mitigate all the risks, someone does injure themselves or there's a fire or break-in, it's really important that you have insurance, and there's several different kinds of insurance. So there are four kinds that are relevant here. Public liability is the most important, and that's for any user or trespasser. Anybody that goes onto the land will be covered by the public liability insurance. You also need employers' liability insurance, even if you're not employing anybody, because that also covers volunteers. So that will cover your committee going onto the site to do whatever, and it will also cover all the allotment holders, if they're volunteering, say you have a day when you're tidying up the site, then it basically in law they need the same protection. You have the same duty of care to volunteers as you do to employees. Buildings, equipment and contents insurance, very important to cover your sheds or any tools you keep inside your sheds, although we always suggest that you don't keep very expensive tools on the allotment site, especially not expensive trimmers, things like that, because it's just like a red rag to a bull for people to break into your shed if they know that expensive items are kept on site. There's one more kind of insurance which I'm not sure is strictly necessary really, and that's allotmenteers liability insurance, and that covers plot holders individually for any liability for injury relating to their own activity on their own plot, or when they go out to a show, say they're entering some vegetables in a country show. It's not strictly necessary, but it does come free with membership of the National Allotment Society, and a lot of allotment sites, all the members join the society. I think it's only £3 per member, and then it's a group membership, and that comes with that. So when you are looking for insurance for your site, go to a specialist provider, because if you just go to lots of different insurance providers, you'll be on the phone all day trying to explain to them what it is that you want to insure. And because they haven't got a specialist policy that they can just pull out of a drawer, it'll probably be more expensive. So the National Allotment Society, again, offer a good value insurance deal with Chris Knott Insurance. And you'll ring up and you say, I want to insure my allotment site. You know what you're talking about immediately, but they will want to go through questions with you about the activities that take place on that site. And we also have a members discount with McLaren Insurance, and again, they will understand exactly what it is that you're talking about when you ring up to insure an allotment site, so that'll save you a lot of time and frustration. And that's it from me.
Okay, we're just going to do another breakout session now, I believe, Heidi. And
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I thought, well, we thought that I'd be best placed to describe this scenario because I'm working with Pembrokeshire Council and a community interest company who are looking to take on the allotments from Pembrokeshire Council, and it's quite a complicated process. We have been having weekly meetings, but with the vaccine rollout and the current situation, we've had a little bit of a pause the last few weeks because Pembrokeshire Council have got other priorities. But one of the offer really is that Pembrokeshire Council are looking potentially to transfer all their allotment sites to a community interest company, and that would be via a sort of long-term lease and service level agreement. This is very much in the early stages at the moment, and it's certainly not a done deal by any means. There's lots of consultation to happen, and but we thought it would be really useful to have a look at from the community interest company's perspective, so that they would be a legal entity, but there's bound to be some opportunities and potential threats or risks that are worth discussing, and be good to sort of perhaps try to summarise for the community interest company. It'd be a good exercise for everyone to do. So I think we're going to go into breakout rooms now, Heidi.
Yeah. So I'm going to put everyone back in. You're going to go back into the same room with the same people. And
Davis is asking to be in my group because he's in the
okay, hold on.
Pembrokeshire group.
Okay.
And we swap him.
Yeah. What group?
I was number 2.
Sorry, what was the name again?
Richard Davis.
Okay. can't actually see his. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I'll move him into group 2. Bear with me.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, the staff members in charge of your group will summarise this for you when you reach your breakout session, and we'll have 10 minutes. I think it is it, Heidi?
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes. Yeah, it won't be too long, and then we'll feed back again. So I'm going to open all the rooms now, and we'll come back again in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't give my group a warning that we were finishing. Sorry about that, Joanne.
Everybody should have had something come on their screen that says it's closing in 1 minute.
Oh, I saw it. I just didn't say anything.
It's not just you, though. Everybody will get that.
Oh, right.
If you're
Okay, jolly good.
Everyone gets it. Well, should be
good.
in theory.
Okay. Yes.
Right. I think we're all back again. Great. I don't know if we need these slides anymore, so shall we stop sharing?
I think
we can get rid of those.
Yeah, we can get rid of them.
Okay, great.
Better to see people's faces.
So we'll just do a very quick feedback again from those groups, and I'll just begin again with Gary, just because I like continuity here.
Yeah, it's easy to start with number 1. I think generally we said, yeah, there's some real opportunities here to consider. Some of the things that we listed were it can really ensure that allotment sites are well managed for the communities on the ground, rather than having that central local authority oversight and limited resources into them. Can make sure that allotment sites are really fully utilised to the needs of their community, so they can react quicker. They can probably be, in some cases, a little bit braver than local authorities may be, for that risk of being challenged over stuff. The groups themselves are potentially less risk averse, so willing to do more, involve more communities within those sites, etc., etc. An opportunity that was suggested was around that in some places where it's happened, that company, that organisation that's taking on site or sites could and should allow membership, so that the individual members of the plot holders become formal members of the organisation responsible for overseeing their allotments. And to me, that's a really great positive that could come out of it, because we know if you get people's buy-in, effectively they're joining a company and paying a membership to that company. They are wholly ingrained in making sure that that company works and goes forward. So some really positive.
Gary, that's the difference. Is that a difference between the CIO type of governance and the KIC? The CIO?
You can have members within a CIO, within a KIC, or within a company. That's fine. It just depends how you define your articles or your rules, in which case, so you would need to make sure that you allow membership and at different levels. But yeah, that's possible within all of those, which is good.
Okay, thank you.
And then just a point of concern or note was around not losing the engagement from the local authority, so not allowing them just to cut all ties and disappear into the background and do nothing to continually support them going forwards. And one of the sort of the risks that was highlighted was that process can potentially be quite drawn out, quite strained, and when talking from Swansea's point of view, that they went through a similar process, but they couldn't get that single entity to take them on. The risk has become that actually now all of the sites are operating individually and are left to fend for themselves, for want of a better word. Some have tried to cluster together to share information and resources. So I guess it's clocking that. What if it doesn't work? What is the default? Does it go back to the local authority, and do they just wash their hands of it and say, well, no, we push this out to you, we want nothing of it? And therefore then the trickle down is that every site gets left on its own, and that process needs to be managed formally through the agreements or through pre-planning, to be honest, even, and just clocking it as a potential risk. So yeah, some really good positives, couple of risks to be aware of, and I think the general census was, yeah, definitely the way to start out and the way to try and make it work.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. Lucy, do you want to tell us about your group?
I found this really useful actually, because I'm not brilliant at different types of governance, and I think that is a way of potentially negating some of the risks. And we talked a lot about opportunities, and I think overall we felt it was a better thing to be doing than having the local authority manage it, but not forgetting their responsibility as well. There's lots of opportunities, but yes, we wanted to ensure that things like the money was held robustly, and finance was managed transparently, good communication, and as Gary's touched on, governance and structure we felt needed to be very robust, and having some sort of membership of other organisations locally. For instance, in Pembrokeshire, there's the voluntary organisation PAVS and PlanEd. Also, just being really clear with people, and as the process is very drawn out, we're sort of stuck in this position at the moment where we're waiting for the local authority to release information to plot holders, so we can't consult. And then there's the danger of the rumour mill starting, and myths, and you have to manage that level of concern and sort of local politics, if you like. But the idea that every tenant could be a member, I think, is something that is something to be encouraged. And the fact, that there's the possibility of making a profit and raising funds and putting that profit back in, and investing into sites. So overall, we felt that the opportunities outweighed the risks.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. And Sarah?
We felt less positively about it. I don't know if that's because my sort of natural cautious nature tainted a sort of feeling in the group. So we had 3 people from local authorities, and they knew it from a community perspective, and me in our group. And although we could see the positives of having the community at the heart of everything and having more freedom to do things on their site and more of that community feeling and feeling empowered, we also felt like it's a group looking after several different sites, which is quite a hefty role to take on, and they're volunteers, and that might be possibly a step too far, and there should certainly be something in the agreement where the responsibility could revert to the local authority if something goes badly wrong, because allotments are a statutory obligation of the local authority, and it seems like a lot of responsibility to take on, and there's like a halfway to this situation. where an individual site is community managed, and we thought that was generally a very positive thing. But again, with the possibility for it to go back into local authority management, and there was a parallel drawn with community centres, you know, where if a committee folds or there's a big falling out in a committee, that you know, the rest of the community loses out if there's a big problem with the committee that manages something, so that, you know, the local authority really would have to still be quite closely involved and there as a backup, and any agreement have you know, the clauses in it about making sure that this carries on working well for the community into the long term, and that too much responsibility isn't put on volunteers that have, you know, got other things to do in their lives. Yeah, so I think that was about it.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. We had a really small group, but we had Lena from Caradigan in our group, and she's pretty much experiencing exactly this, because she's taking on an allotment site that was local authority land, and she is in the process of getting it. You know, well, the council's paid, I think, about £10,000 already to get it cleared, and there's probably more money to spend. So we talked a bit more about her site, because obviously it's a similar situation, and I guess, you know, she's going to turn it into a community allotment, so that's going to be a bit of a change from the kind of traditional allotments. So there's some really interesting opportunities and new ways of doing things there, which probably wouldn't have happened if the council had sort of kept hold of it. But on the other hand, I think we also talked about the risks and some of the issues too, because, you know, she didn't want to just take on the land in a dilapidated state and just say, oh, that's fine. And there's some issues with water as well that you're still working out. And so, although she's really grateful for the site she's got, she also doesn't want the council to just walk away right yet, because there's things they need to do to get it into the right state. Lena, so if you want to add anything to that, because we're talking mostly about you, but feel free. But yeah, it was really interesting sort of hearing about that. So okay, I think we're gonna have to move on, and really give you a chance to ask questions if you have any, from anything that we've discussed so far. Obviously, it's hard to do this justice even though it's 2 hours. There's quite a lot to discuss, and there are quite a lot of issues that we could talk about. But if there's anything in particular that you would like to ask about, you can either put your question on chat or unmute yourself and ask it. That's
I think
fine.
what we should do, Heidi, is just quickly look at a couple of questions that come in
Yep.
earlier that I think we can answer.
Sure.
So I think one was around from Mary, I think, if I recall, about sort of sharing data and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What we can certainly do to individuals is share the research data that we did on behalf of Welsh Government. What I'm not allowed to do is put it anywhere public, because it's a little bit, dare I say it, naming and shaming some local authorities, and we're not interested in doing that. We just need to show where the gaps and the weaknesses are. But I might just very briefly share the latest spreadsheet of where we're at with provision versus population. So this, don't take this as read. We know there's some gaps. Figures are going to be really small on your screen, I'm afraid, but basically I tried to color code them. So anyone that's in green is doing pretty well at meeting a provision. Sorry, I can't get it to show on a single screen. The ones in sort of yellow, amberish are sort of in the middle. And if you can look to the column R here, that's the percentage of provision they're meeting against the current guidance. So if I took a line of Gwent at the top, sorry, I'm moving around, they are providing 107% of local authority provision for allotment plots, or provision across their local authority. Fantastic. Caerphilly, absolutely amazing, outstanding, by far the winners, 173% of provision. So we need to understand, and I really want to understand, what are Caerphilly doing so well to meet that level of provision. And then if you looked to the lower end of the scale, and this is where I say it gets a bit naming and shaming, Wrexham only meeting 20% of the proposed provision. So we've got that sort of data that I can share with you personally. It can be a bit stress tested, and anything that's in
Gary, can you explain what the
provision is?
Can you explain what the guidance is of what the provision should be? Sorry.
Yeah, I can try. So where we're struggling a bit is the current guidance, if you like, the official guidance is 50 years old. So it's pretty rubbish. That original guidance was you should create 11.2 plots per 1,000 households if you converted it in size to plots. But the National Society and us are saying actually things have changed. We've got far more flats, we've got far more houses with no garden space or limited green space. And the current suggested guidance is now 20 plots per 1,000 households. So it's not a huge amount by far, but in some cases, obviously green space is really at a premium. So it is harder. And obviously some of the larger local authorities like Cardiff and Swansea would really struggle to find that level of provision in green spaces, but it's not to say it's not hard in some cases. So yeah, so we're aiming for 20 plots per 1,000 households.
And so they have this obligation to provide these plots. So they've got an obligation to provide a set number of plots per household. Is that what you're saying?
Yep.
And so
there's a statutory duty, if you like,
okay.
although it's only guidance on how many they should provide. What we haven't got, sadly, is any legislation or any powers in what timeframes they have to provide that provision. So they could say, I clock your demand and do absolutely nothing with it for 20 years and not get into trouble. And that's where we need to build those relationships to say you can't just do that anymore. That's not acceptable. But legally they can, sadly.
Right, okay.
And can I just say, like you said, Gary, with some local authorities, it would be so difficult for them to provide the suggested provision because they're so built up and they have so little land in local authority ownership that if the Welsh Government were to make that an actual statutory obligation, the number of allotments you have to provide, some local authorities would just find it entirely impossible. So it's a real sort of difficult balance, you know, of like wanting to say, yes, this should be provided for people, but if it's not possible, then we'd just be putting local authorities in an impossible position.
And what I
they don't
would
have. Sorry,
sorry, Mary.
I was just going to say, do they then are they expected to then buy land? I did read somewhere in one of their government documents that there was this compulsory requirement for them to purchase land.
Yeah. So it's a good point. So I think my argument is yes, they've got powers for compulsory purchase, so they can buy land for allotments. They've got absolute rights to do that. Actually, more interestingly, I think they've got rights to compulsory lease, which doesn't upset landowners quite so much and is more affordable longer term, as in they have to pay market price or above market price. If you're going to take a piece of land off a private landowner, by Christ, they're going to milk you for every penny they can possibly get, and that becomes just unaffordable for the local authorities. One of my opportunities that I see is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the statutory powers fall all the way down to town and community councils as well. So there is absolutely no reason why your local town or community council shouldn't be looking for land and providing land by whatever means it can. And that's normally a good conversation within their councillors group and their communities, right? Who's got some spare land? Let's make this work for our local communities and it's not going to cost the earth. And if they can't find that, then actually they've got powers to compulsory purchase or compulsory lease as a community council. Now it's quite a brave step, and Lucy will certainly argue that most of our community councils, that would probably push them to their absolute limits of taking on responsibility. But some of the larger ones absolutely do already, and certainly some of the town councils do and are already administering an allotment provision. So we can learn from others that are doing it. But I think that's where the potential opportunity lies more than looking to local authorities that have limited budgets, have got absolutely limited resources, stretched to the maximum, and haven't got that clear picture of what's going on in their smaller communities. So I see that as an opportunity. It's also a big wow. That's a hard thing to push, but we'll keep trying. Sarah, did you?
If you're getting the picture for them, then maybe that will drive the need and they can deliver potentially.
Yes, it's more approachable for people as well to join their community council. If you've got a small group in your village or town that wants allotments and there's no allotment provision, join the community council, push that as a priority and try and make that happen. But obviously the difficulty with the land is that you want allotments to be in built-up areas because you want people to be able to access them on foot or bike. You don't want them to have to go miles in a car to get to the allotments. And all the land within the development boundary is going to be very valuable land, some of which is earmarked for development, and local authorities obviously also have a target that they have to meet of making new housing available. So it's competing pressures on the land that is available is part of the issue. But usually if you persist, you know, a piece of land can be found. It doesn't have to be enormous, and land that's unsuitable for development as well. So for example, at the moment there's a lot of land that has been earmarked for extensions to cemeteries in the past, and then with new regulations from NRW about groundwater and cemeteries, the land that they've bought for is no longer allowed to be used for that. So just have to get creative about looking for bits of land that are not suitable for other things.
Yeah, good points, Sarah. And we'll share some within our guidance and toolkits. And obviously, if you've got a quest to find land, you can come to us and come to Lucy, and we can try and help. We take offers of land as well. So Lucy's got a call later this week with a private farm owner looking at potentially 60 acres on offer to communities to do more with around food. So we occasionally get that sort of offer. What normally happens, though, sadly, we get offered land where we can't find a community, or we've got loads of communities and can't find the land. So it doesn't always work, but we will try our hardest, and sometimes it takes years, so bear with us. But I think there's definitely opportunities there. I think, Mary, your other question was around Give an Acre. That's an emerging project for us. So it's a bit watch this space, but it's being supported by NFU Wales, which is fantastic. So they're looking at pushing it out their members, and basically we might just be a bit of a dating agency with farmers offering an acre, finding those communities that can make use of it, and creating those loose-ish agreements on how it should be managed and by whom, and not for private gain and all that sort of stuff, which farmers might be concerned about. And then Richard, you put a question in there around accessing funds.
There are two other questions. Yeah, one, Richard's questions about accessing funds to develop the site.
Yeah, so I think you're Pembrokeshire, aren't you, Richard? I think the first place to look should be your local authority that's about to get a handout of Welsh Government money in April, and really push them on where's that money going and how's it going to be spent? How do you get access to some of it as an allotment manager, if you like?
Yeah, so yes, because the initial, you know, like I've had it for 3 years, and the local authority who I rented from said that there's absolutely no money in the budget. I mean, the fence has fallen down. I mean, it's in a real state. So everything that needs to be done is, you know, they've got nothing there for it. And so trying to find that fund from somewhere just to get it, you know.
Well, they're definitely going to have some ring-fenced money for allotments. It's not a huge amount because it's spread across 21 local authorities, but they will have some. And if they haven't got somewhere to spend it, then you can jump in with an off-the-shelf ready proposal that says, give me some and I'll spend it wisely. That'd be useful. There's easy-ish small grants if you are an organisation like the Lottery Awards for All, up to £10,000 now in Wales. Really simple process, turned around in 8 weeks, and generally a sort of 65–70% success rate on those smaller funds. We can help you look for other alternatives. We've got a member of the team that specialises in helping groups find money, or at least looking at where opportunities are. We can't write bids for you, but we can certainly put a bit of red pen on them and make sure they fit the criteria. So there are a few opportunities, and internally we have got a small chunk of money for the next 2 years to support capital developments on community sites. So if you're set up as a community site, which you might well be, then you could potentially look to us as well, and we'll be sharing that through our sort of newsletters and websites, as we've done with some of you this year. Linos, did you want to come in?
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add to Richard's issue. Like I say, we've been keeping the pressure on Carmarthenshire County Council, and one of the ways that we were lucky enough possibly to get them to fund part of the clearing of the site was to get the support of a local councillor in the area where the allotment is, and for her to put the pressure on the council because she's more aware of where the funding issues are and what funding pots haven't been used to date. And also by this time, some of you already know most probably, they have got an overspill of spending that they need to spend by the end of this month so that they can draw in money again in April. So you might want to start putting pressure on now, Richard, to see whether they can support you. Yeah, that's all. Thank you, Gary.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking, Richard, as well, Pembrokeshire National Park normally have a local development fund or some sort of regeneration development fund. Definitely a place to go. I don't know how much they ever have in their pot and how well it's spent, but place to look.
Yeah, they've got the Sustainable Development Fund, which we've just looking into applying for now. So that's one of the next ones that we try and
and use the likes of Planed,
social
and
housing
PAVs.
providers as well.
Yeah.
Social housing providers usually have a fund if you've got any social housing
Okay, well,
associations in
that's
the
another one
area.
to look. Yeah, another one to look at for us.
Great. Any other questions, Heidi?
Yeah, there's one more question, which is what level of management is the authority required to provide for the land? Can we ask our community council to manage the project?
The answer is none. They don't have to provide any, sadly. Many choose to, and they choose to do that through the revenue they generate from it or not. Often, I think I'm only really aware of one local authority that actually makes money on their allotments. All the rest, it's a direct cost to the local authority. So the least they can do, that's what they'll probably get away with. But can community councils manage them? Yes, absolutely. They've got statutory powers within town and community council rights, if you like, how they're governed to manage allotment sites. Yep, and green spaces.
Great. Okay. There's nothing else in the chat asking anything, and we are exactly at 3 o'clock. So I don't know whether you just want to talk about the resources that are available. I think do you have a slide?
Yes, I do. Sorry, I was just typing in the messages. Yeah, so we'll make sure that this is on the, we'll PDF the presentation if you like, and send it out. But on our website, which is where you should find a lot of them here, those links will get you to some specific allotment resources. Some of the specific land resources that Lucy talked around CLAS are in there as well. NSAUG is obviously a really good place to start as well, but sometimes to access their actual documents, you have to be a member. It's not expensive to be a member. And if you are setting yourselves up as an association, absolutely, I would join as a member, because you get access to all sorts of legal support and real skills around allotments, more so than we have. We're very much more interested in the community engagement and elements of growing and allotments, but they're I don't know, they're more clued up on the statutory powers and provisions as well.
Okay. And then I was just going to mention a couple other training opportunities if you enjoyed what we did today. And they're not all on allotments.
The press release there as well on new planning rights for structures. That last link is the press release, because Welsh Government have given some permitted development rights to build small structures on allotment plots. That was in December.
Okay. Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, just two other sort of training opportunities within social farms and gardens. Next week on the 10th of February, there's a training on CSA support. I'm not exactly sure of the time, maybe, but it's next week on the 10th.
Yeah, I guess on that point, just we've got a really good events page on the website and workshops. Click on there. You should see the ones that are coming up, move up the page, and it will be on there as all the others are.
Okay. And then the other thing is we've got a European 10-week course called Gardenizer, which we sort of are regularly running. This is an online course, and it's for people that are managers at community gardens, city farms, care farms. And again, that's on our events page. So if you want to know more about that, we're taking applications for that now. And then I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say before we sign off. Really?
I think from my view, great to have a real range of people contributing
really
today. That really helps local authority down to communities, because we only have a good overarching vision and we don't always get to see what really goes on in the ground or within the local authority. So that's been really beneficial.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks
really
for
great.
coming, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Diolch.
Diolch.
I was just going through some of the messages, Heidi, and